They didn't use guns. They didn't fire a single shot. But in one night, a group of ordinary men walked away with $70 million in untraceable cash, the largest train robbery in history. This is the story of the Great Brink's MAT-style heist on rails.
On this bridge, and £2.5 million were unloaded, brought down that embankment, and loaded onto a lorry standing where that van is standing now.
A robbery so daring it became legendary. The men who carried it out were seen as criminal masterminds, folk heroes, and reckless fools all at once. And the train? It wasn't just carrying money. It was hauling the fragile trust of an entire financial system. This is how a group of men, with nothing more than inside knowledge, brute force, and nerves of steel, pulled off the heist of the century. The year was 1993. The target, a Royal Mail overnight train traveling from Glasgow to London. Its cargo was no ordinary freight. Inside the high-value packages carriage were millions in old, worn banknotes, destined to be destroyed. They were fragile, faded, and scheduled for incineration, but they were still legal tender. And that made them worth a fortune. On board, there were no armed guards, just postal workers sorting letters under dim carriage lights. For decades, the Royal Mail had relied on routine and secrecy rather than firepower to protect its wealth. Who would dare to rob a train in the middle of the night, deep in the countryside? The answer: a team of men who had grown tired of scraping by, tired of small-time jobs, and who saw in that train not just money, but immortality. The man at the center of the plan was Ronnie Biggs, a career criminal. Biggs had been part of the notorious Great Train Robbery of 1963, a heist that netted £2.6 million and shook Britain to its core. That crime had made him infamous, but decades later, he was back in the shadows, drawn once again to the thrill of impossible money. Biggs wasn't a mastermind in the traditional sense. He wasn't a genius mathematician or a tactical soldier. What he did have was instinct. He knew how to pick the right men. Men who could keep their mouths shut. Men who wouldn't panic under pressure. Men willing to cross the line. Together they formed a crew built for speed, secrecy, and ruthlessness. For weeks, the crew watched the train. They studied its route through the countryside, memorized its timetable, and learned which stretches of track were most vulnerable. They discovered that near Ledburn, Buckinghamshire, the train slowed as it approached signals. The area was remote, dark, and far from police patrols. It was the perfect place to strike. The plan was brutal in its simplicity. Rig a false red signal light to force the train to stop. Overpower the driver and postal workers. Uncouple the engine and the money carriage. Drive it forward to a bridge where waiting trucks would be ready. Load the money and vanish into the night. No gunfire, no explosions. Just timing, precision, and sheer nerve. It was August 8, 1993, just after midnight. The countryside was still, the only sound the distant hum of the approaching train. The red light flickered on. The driver saw it, obeyed, and pulled the brakes. The screech of steel echoed into the night. He stepped down from the cabin to check the signal. That's when he saw them. Figures in masks moving quickly, carrying nothing more than rope, bars, and their own confidence. The robbers swarmed him. He resisted and was struck down, stunned but alive. The rest of the crew rushed aboard, overwhelming the postal workers. The men weren't harmed, but they were tied up and left in the corner of the carriage, wide-eyed and terrified. With practiced speed, the robbers uncoupled the carriages. The engine groaned forward, pulling only the money wagon, until it reached the bridge where trucks stood waiting in the shadows. And there it was, $70 million in cash, stacked in heavy canvas sacks. For the robbers, the moment was surreal. They weren't just stealing money. They were touching the kind of fortune most people only ever see in movies. In a blur of motion, they passed sack after sack into the trucks. The money seemed endless, spilling out like treasure from a vault. In under 30 minutes, it was done. The trucks roared away, leaving behind an empty carriage and a trail of disbelief. By dawn, the country was in uproar. The newspapers splashed it across the front page, the heist of the century. The police were humiliated. A gang of criminals had humiliated an entire system, bringing down a train with nothing more than a rigged light bulb and a plan. Politicians called for answers. Banks and postal authorities scrambled to explain how such a lapse was possible. But while the world watched in fascination, the robbers were already trapped in their own web. Stealing millions is one thing. Spending it is another. The crew quickly realized that untraceable paper cash still had a shadow. Every big purchase drew attention. Every flashy car, every sudden investment whispered of crime. Some members couldn't resist. Lavish homes, sports cars, and expensive nights out. Others tried to launder their fortunes through banks, shell companies, and offshore accounts. And paranoia set in. The robbers knew the police were closing in. Informants circled. Old loyalties began to fray. The Metropolitan Police launched one of the most aggressive investigations in British history. Raids swept across London. Homes were torn apart. Suspects were questioned day and night. Slowly, piece by piece, the story came together. It didn't take long for cracks to show. One robber was caught flashing new money at a nightclub. Another was betrayed by a business associate. Informants traded names for freedom. The trail led back to the hideouts, where careless fingerprints and abandoned evidence told the story the men thought they'd erased. One by one, the crew fell. Heavy prison sentences followed, decades in cold gray cells. Their empire of cash crumbled into nothing. But not all of them lived to see prison. Some were hunted down by rival criminals. Others drank, gambled, and overdosed their fortunes away. For many, the money was less a blessing than a curse. Families broke apart. Children grew up in shame. The dream of a new life dissolved into paranoia and despair. The great prize, the $70 million, slipped through their fingers like sand. And yet, the robbery lived on. To some, the robbers became folk heroes. Working-class men who had dared to strike back against a corrupt system, who had outwitted the banks and the government. Their audacity was celebrated in whispers at pubs and in films that retold their story with a romantic shine. To others, they were nothing more than thugs. Greedy, selfish men who had hurt innocents, scarred workers, and left behind only wreckage. What can't be denied is the hold the story still has on the public imagination. Even today, documentaries, books, and movies revisit that night. The image of masked men pulling millions off a train under the cover of darkness is irresistible, a symbol of both daring genius and reckless folly. But the legend is only half the truth. Behind the myth, there is a darker reality. No one really won. The robbers lost their freedom. The victims lost their peace. And society was left with one haunting reminder that even the strongest systems can be undone by A. The $70 million train heist is remembered as both a myth and a warning. It showed that even ordinary men could take on an empire and win, if only for a moment. But it also showed how greed corrodes loyalty, how violence scars lives, and how fortune gained in the night can vanish by morning. The world still calls it the heist of the century, not because of what was stolen, but because of what it revealed. That beneath the order of society lies the possibility of chaos, and that sometimes the line between legend and disaster is just one red signal away.